A cold billionaire tried to frame his innocent maid by planting her fingerprints on a glass to blame her for a crime. She didn't commit, but what he didn't expect was that his own non-verbal autistic son would speak for the first time in public, exposing the truth and saving the only person who ever truly cared for him. Before we continue with this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Oh, and don't forget to comment below where you're watching us from. We love to know that. Angela had just arrived at the massive iron gates of the Cooper estate, carrying a single suitcase and a head full of uncertainty. She had traveled far for this job, leaving behind the small apartment where memories of her lost baby haunted every corner. The mansion before her was enormous, clean and quiet, completely different from her own chaotic past. A man in a dark uniform opened the door without speaking and led her through the long driveway toward the main entrance. Angela was greeted briefly by a housekeeper who handed her a uniform and gave basic instructions. There were no warm welcomes, only cold efficiency. She learned she would be responsible for keeping the west wing of the mansion clean, including the rooms belonging to the young son of Mr. Cooper. Richard Cooper himself didn't appear during her first day. His staff spoke of him only when necessary. Angela didn't ask questions. She needed this job to survive, to start over, and to find something new to hold on to after so much pain. The first time Angela saw Oliver, it was from a distance. He was sitting on the floor of a large playroom, surrounded by toys that looked untouched. His dark hair covered part of his face, and he didn't look up when she walked past. The other staff members avoided that part of the house unless absolutely necessary. They whispered about the boy's condition, severe autism, and said he never spoke a single word. Angela was warned not to get involved, to just do her cleaning and stay quiet, but Angela couldn't ignore him. She had known loss, and when she looked at Oliver, she saw the same emptiness in his eyes that she felt in her heart. The playroom was full of expensive furniture, but it felt cold. Angela began cleaning the room slowly, not rushing, not leaving as quickly as the others. She made sure not to get too close, but she wanted Oliver to see she wasn't afraid of him. She hoped quietly that maybe he would let her stay. Day by day, Angela kept her routine. She cleaned Oliver's room with care, always speaking softly when she entered, even though he never replied. He didn't even look at her most of the time, but she noticed things. He would stop rocking slightly when she talked. Once, she left a small stuffed bear near where he sat, and the next day, it had been moved. Angela started leaving little signs of kindness, a folded blanket, a favorite snack nearby, music playing faintly from a speaker. Slowly, Oliver began to respond in tiny ways. He didn't speak, but he no longer turned his back to her. One day, she came into the room and found him watching her mop the floor. It wasn't much, but for Angela, it meant the world. She never pushed him, never tried to force interaction. She just showed up every day, gently, hoping that her presence could bring him some calm. He reminded her of what she had lost and gave her a reason to care again. Angela also began noticing the odd behavior in the house. The staff were polite but distant. Cameras were placed in corners that didn't make sense, like the kitchen hallway or the garden path. The other employees rarely spoke to her unless necessary, and when they did, their eyes flicked around nervously, as if they were being listened to. Richard Cooper was rarely seen, but when he appeared, his presence was tense and commanding. He didn't ask Angela about her work. He only reminded her of strict rules. She wasn't to enter certain rooms. She wasn't to speak to guests. She wasn't to ask questions. Angela followed the rules, but her instincts told her something was wrong. One night, while taking out the trash, she heard voices arguing behind a closed door. She paused to listen, but the conversation ended abruptly. The next morning, that hallway was closed off completely. Angela tried to focus on her tasks and her growing connection with Oliver, but the unease in the mansion was growing stronger every day. Despite the strange atmosphere, Angela continued to show up for Oliver. He had become part of her daily life now. There were moments when he would reach out for a toy she offered or sit quietly while she read aloud. It was never consistent, but it gave her hope. She never spoke of her past to anyone in the house, but being near Oliver helped her feel like she was slowly healing. He trusted her in ways that felt sacred. One morning, she walked into the playroom to find him holding the same bear she had left weeks ago. He didn't say anything, but he held it close to his chest. That was the first time she saw a tear in his eye. She sat nearby, silent, letting him have his moment. Later that day, she found a small drawing under his bed. Just scribbles, but they felt important. Angela knew something had changed. He was starting to feel something again, and she was part of it. That made her feel like she had purpose again. But even as this fragile bond grew, Angela couldn't shake the feeling that something else was happening around her, something she wasn't being told. There were too many rules, too many closed doors. She began piecing things together in her mind. Why had someone like her, with no references and a complicated past, been hired for such a high-end position? Why did Richard Cooper need a full-time live-in housekeeper in a house with so few people? And why did he never interact with his son? Angela started to suspect that her being there wasn't just a coincidence. The idea terrified her, but she tried to stay calm for Oliver's sake. She couldn't leave now, not when the boy was finally opening up. Still, the looks she got from certain staff members, the way people went silent when she walked in, all pointed to something deeper. Angela didn't know yet that she had been chosen for a reason, and that she wasn't just there to clean. She was already part of something much darker than she had imagined. Angela was waking up earlier each day, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. Her connection with Oliver was growing stronger. At first, he would only let her sit nearby. Then, he let her hand him toys. Eventually, he allowed her to gently touch his arm when helping him with his clothes. Each step was slow, but to Angela, it felt like a miracle. She prepared his meals with care, even cutting the sandwiches into shapes to make him smile. To her surprise, Oliver started eating everything she gave him. He used to throw food on the floor or ignore it completely. Now he waited for her, sometimes even standing near the kitchen door. He also began following her around the house, staying close while she cleaned or organized. He didn't speak much, but his eyes followed her, and his drawings were now clearly meant for her. One afternoon, while she sat beside him, he whispered the word, "Mommy." Angela froze. Her heart raced. She didn't correct him. She couldn't. That moment stayed with Angela. It made her cry later alone in her room, but it wasn't the same kind of crying as before. It wasn't just sadness this time. It was something else. Something she hadn't felt in a long time. Oliver had filled a space inside her that had been broken since the day her baby died. She knew Oliver had lost his mother too, and maybe they were both searching for the same thing. In their quiet routines, something real had formed. He didn't speak again, but he looked at her differently now. She knew he trusted her. Angela started to believe she could have a new beginning. But while her attention was focused on the boy, something else was happening behind the scenes. One morning, Richard Cooper asked about a missing item, a necklace that had been kept in his office. He didn't accuse her directly, but his eyes stayed on her longer than usual. The other staff looked uncomfortable. Angela didn't understand what was going on yet, but she felt something was wrong. Later that day, Megan, Richard's lawyer and someone who always walked through the house like she owned it, called a meeting with the staff. She said she had found the missing necklace under the couch in the main hallway. The way she said it didn't sound right to Angela. Why would such an expensive item be left in such a place? Why was Megan the one to find it? And why were all the staff looking at Angela now, like they knew something she didn't? Angela tried to stay calm, but she could feel the shift. People started treating her differently. Some avoided her, some watched her. She wasn't sure if she was being paranoid, but the tension in the house had changed. She told herself to focus on Oliver, to keep doing her job. But deep down, she knew someone was trying to turn things against her. The necklace incident didn't feel like an accident. It felt like a setup. And Angela had no way to prove otherwise. Richard didn't say much about it, but his silence felt heavier than words. One night, Angela passed by the office door and saw him inside, alone, staring at something on his desk. He glanced up, and their eyes met for a second. He didn't speak, but he didn't look away either. Angela continued down the hall, her heart beating fast. That same evening, Richard began a new plan, one Angela wouldn't notice. He carefully took out a glass from the cupboard, wiped it clean with a cloth, and placed it on a silver tray in the sitting room, near where Angela often cleaned. It looked like any other glass, just part of the houseware, but it was meant to be touched. Richard's plan was simple. He wanted her fingerprints on the glass. He planned to use it later as evidence, in case he needed to accuse her again. This time, not just with suspicion, but with proof. Angela had no idea what was being prepared for her. She went on with her tasks, unaware she was stepping into a trap. The next morning, Angela found Oliver waiting for her near the stairs. He handed her another drawing, this one showing two figures holding hands. She smiled and took it, telling him it was beautiful. Her world still felt small, limited to Oliver, her room, and her work, but it was a world that gave her comfort. She didn't think about the necklace anymore. She assumed the situation had passed. Richard hadn't said anything else, and Megan had stopped giving her strange looks. Angela felt things might return to normal. As she cleaned the sitting room, she noticed the glass on the tray and moved it slightly to dust under it. She didn't think twice. She touched it without knowing that was exactly what she wasn't supposed to do. Her fingerprints were now where Richard wanted them. After finishing the cleaning, she returned to the kitchen, feeling good about the day. Oliver was drawing again. She didn't see Richard watching from the hallway, noting that the plan had worked just as he had hoped. Angela had no idea that her quiet day had been part of something much bigger. She didn't know Richard had taken the glass back to his office and placed it in a small plastic bag. He handled it like evidence in a case. To him, it was a step in protecting something, or maybe controlling something. He didn't trust people, and he never hired anyone without a reason. Angela was starting to feel like family to Oliver, and Richard couldn't allow that to go too far without knowing what she was capable of. He didn't care about kindness or the bond between them. He cared about control. That night, Angela tucked Oliver into bed. He let her hug him briefly, which was a big step. As she left the room, she felt like she had done something right. She didn't know the walls were closing in. She didn't know the trap had already been triggered. The necklace, the suspicion, and now the glass, it was all part of a plan. And Angela was walking straight into it. Angela sat stiffly at the table in the courtroom, her hands tightly clasped on her lap. The room was bright and cold, filled with quiet murmurs and the sound of papers being shuffled. A glass of water had just been placed in front of her by one of the assistants. She glanced at it, but didn't touch it right away. Her mouth was dry, her heart was racing, and her fingers were shaking slightly. The judge looked down at her from the bench, waiting for her to answer the last question. Megan sat to the side, scribbling notes and occasionally whispering something to Richard, who watched Angela without blinking. Angela's mind was foggy. She felt like everything was moving too fast. The questions, the pressure, the accusations, none of it made full sense. But the glass of water sat there, simple and still, tempting her to drink. She thought maybe it would help her calm down. Slowly, she reached out her hand, unaware of the true reason it had been placed there. As Angela's fingers moved toward the glass, the courtroom suddenly shifted. Before she could touch it, a sharp, loud voice broke through the silence. "It's a trap, Mummy!" Everyone turned. Oliver, who had been sitting quietly with a caretaker at the back of the room, had jumped up from his seat and was now running toward Angela. His small face was filled with panic. He reached her and grabbed her arm tightly, looking straight into her eyes. "It's a trap," he said again, louder this time. The entire room went completely quiet. Even the judge froze, stunned. Oliver's voice was clear, strong, and emotional. It was the first time he had ever spoken in front of anyone outside the house. For a moment, nobody knew what to do. Angela looked at him, her mouth slightly open in shock, while her eyes filled with tears. He had called her Mommy again, this time in public, this time to protect her. It was no mistake. He knew exactly what he was saying. The judge leaned forward, confused and clearly moved by the moment. Richard quickly stood up and walked toward the judge's bench, trying to explain. "He's confused. The boy doesn't know what's going on," he said. Megan joined in, saying that Oliver didn't understand the situation and was simply reacting emotionally to seeing Angela in distress. But it was too late. Everyone in the courtroom had seen what happened. Oliver's words had been loud and clear. This wasn't just a child randomly shouting, it was a warning. It was a message. Angela pulled Oliver into a hug and held him tightly. She didn't care what anyone thought. Her tears fell freely. The connection between her and Oliver could no longer be denied or dismissed. The room was still silent, as if everyone was processing what had just happened. Angela looked around and saw faces changing. People were beginning to see her not as a criminal, but as someone that boy truly loved and trusted. Angela couldn't speak right away. She just held Oliver close, feeling the weight of his little arms wrapped around her. Her chest hurt from the emotion, but it was the kind of pain that came with something important, something real. She had been alone for so long, suffering in silence, trying to heal. And now this boy, who had barely spoken his whole life, had stood up for her in front of everyone. She wasn't sure if she had ever felt anything this powerful. Oliver didn't cry. He simply stood by her side, still holding her arm, still keeping her away from the glass of water. The same glass Richard had prepared days before, hoping to trap her fingerprints. Angela understood everything now. It wasn't just a coincidence. Oliver had been watching. He had understood more than anyone thought, and now he had stopped it. He had stopped her from walking into a lie. That little voice had done more than any lawyer could. It had told the truth. The judge looked down again and asked for order in the courtroom. Slowly, people returned to their seats. Angela stayed where she was, still holding Oliver's hand. Megan seemed visibly uncomfortable, whispering again to Richard, who now avoided looking at Angela directly. The judge asked Angela if she wanted a moment before continuing, but she shook her head. Her voice was shaky, but steady enough as she spoke. She explained she had no idea the glass was important. She explained that she had never stolen anything, that all she had done was care for Oliver like he was her own son, and in some way, he had become that. Her words were simple, but they carried emotion. The judge listened, nodding slightly. It was clear now that things weren't as they had been painted. Richard's plan, so carefully arranged, was falling apart. The glass, the accusations, all of it seemed to lose meaning under the weight of one child's voice and the strength of a bond no one could deny. No one touched the glass. It sat there, untouched, useless now. The courtroom had changed. People looked at Angela with different eyes, softer, more understanding. The judge announced that the session would be paused for review. As people began to stand and collect their things, Angela remained seated with Oliver beside her. He had gone quiet again, leaning against her shoulder. She kissed the top of his head and whispered a thank you. He didn't answer, but she knew he had heard her. Richard left the room quickly, followed by Megan, both of them speaking in low, rushed tones. But their plan had already failed. Angela knew this wasn't the end, but something had shifted. Her innocence had been defended in the most unexpected way. That one sentence from Oliver had done what she couldn't. She had been saved, not by evidence or lawyers, but by love, trust, and truth. And as the door to the courtroom closed, the glass of water still sat where it had been placed, untouched, useless, and forgotten. Angela walked out of the courthouse, holding tightly onto Oliver's hand. The air outside felt heavy, not because of the weather, but because she knew this wasn't truly over. Her name had not been cleared yet. She had only been released under supervision while the investigation continued. Reporters waited at the gates, shouting questions and taking photos as she and Oliver were quickly placed into a car and driven away. Inside the car, she stared out the window, trying to understand what had just happened. Oliver had saved her, but the legal system didn't fully believe it. To them, a child's words, no matter how powerful, weren't enough. She was still being watched. She was still being treated like a suspect. Oliver sat quietly beside her, clutching the drawing he had brought with him to court. The media soon picked up on the story. Headlines began to appear: boy calls housekeeper mommy in courtroom outburst, and emotional bond raises doubts in robbery case. The public was curious. Some were even starting to believe her. Angela had never been on television before, but now her face was on every screen. News stations replayed the video of Oliver running toward her, screaming, "It's a trap! Mommy!" over and over again. Talk shows began discussing the case. Some experts claimed the boy was clearly speaking the truth. Others dismissed it, saying children confuse emotions. Still, Angela's story spread quickly. People started sending messages of support. A few even offered to help. Among those was a woman named Laura Bennett. She introduced herself as an independent investigator. Laura had experience working on difficult cases, especially those involving false accusations and legal manipulation. She contacted Angela directly and said she didn't trust the way things were handled in court. Angela was hesitant at first. She didn't know who to trust anymore, but something in Laura's voice gave her a sense of safety. After a short meeting, Angela agreed to let Laura review the available files, including the security footage from the mansion. It was the first time Angela felt a real chance was opening up. Laura began her work immediately. She requested access to the original surveillance videos, not the edited versions that had been shown in court. With the help of a trusted technician, she began scanning every second of footage from the day before the necklace went missing. What they found made her stop and rewind the same moment again and again. The video had strange cuts, sudden jumps where the camera clearly skipped time. In one important scene, Megan entered the sitting room wearing gloves, looked around, and quietly changed the position of 2 glasses on the tray. Her actions were careful, calculated. There was no sound, only her movements. The technician pointed out that the video had been edited to remove frames, poorly. Whoever did it wasn't skilled enough to hide the signs. Laura took screenshots and documented everything. She then requested an expert analysis of the glass used in court. The results confirmed her suspicions. The glass Angela was supposed to drink from had no traces of saliva. It had never been used. These discoveries brought some hope, but they weren't enough to reopen the case automatically. Laura submitted the evidence to the court, but the system was slow and resistant. The prosecutor refused to admit that there had been a mistake. They said emotional moments couldn't outweigh hard evidence, and since no actual robbery had occurred, they didn't consider it serious enough to change course. It felt like a wall was being built in front of them. Angela was frustrated. She knew the truth, but proving it wasn't easy. Even with video evidence and new forensic reports, the justice system wanted more. Laura didn't give up. She continued contacting legal experts and reporters, hoping someone would listen. The more people learned about the case, the more pressure started to grow outside the courtroom. Angela stayed close to Oliver, trying to keep his routine normal. But inside, she felt the pressure increasing. Every day that passed without a breakthrough felt like another day where Richard and Megan were getting away with everything they had done. Laura spent her evenings reviewing footage, making notes, building a timeline of events. She also interviewed a few former employees of the Cooper mansion. Most were too afraid to speak, but one cleaner, who had been let go shortly before Angela was hired, gave a small but important statement. She said Megan was always present in the rooms where security cameras were installed, and that she often ordered staff not to enter certain areas. This matched Laura's theory that the necklace incident had been a setup from the beginning. But Laura also knew what truly mattered wasn't just the data or the timeline, it was Oliver. His outburst in court had been raw and powerful. That kind of connection couldn't be faked. Laura began including that moment in her reports too, not because it was emotional, but because it was honest. A child who barely spoke had shouted the truth when it mattered most. That meant something. Laura believed in that moment. She believed in Oliver, and she believed in Angela's innocence with full certainty. Angela sat one night watching Oliver sleep, her thoughts spinning. So much had happened in so little time. She had gone from being a simple housekeeper to becoming a public figure in a story much bigger than she ever imagined. But at the center of it all was a boy who had opened her heart again. Angela didn't care about public support or television interviews. All she cared about was keeping Oliver safe and proving the truth. She knew what Megan and Richard had done, and now, finally, someone else knew too. Laura had become her biggest ally. The case was no longer just about a missing necklace or a glass. It had become about justice, about trust, and about breaking a cruel system that protected the powerful. Angela was tired, but not broken. The hunt for the truth had officially begun. Laura promised to keep going, no matter what. And Angela, holding tightly to Oliver's hand again, felt for the first time that the fight was no longer hers alone. Laura walked into the courthouse with a folder full of new evidence. She had documents, video clips, expert analysis, and witness statements. Everything was ready. She believed this time the court would have to listen. The proof was clear. Megan had tampered with the security footage, and the glass used as evidence against Angela had never been touched by her lips. Laura walked confidently to the clerk's desk and filed the motion for review. But within hours, she realized something was wrong. She received a call from a contact at the courthouse who warned her that Richard Cooper had already acted. He used his legal team, money and power to file a request to block the motion. He claimed the new evidence was unreliable and irrelevant. Later that same day, the judge officially denied the request. The video would not be re-examined. The court would not allow the case to be reopened. Laura was shocked. Everything they had found, everything Oliver had done, was being ignored. Richard had used his influence again, and it was working. Angela received the news while sitting at the kitchen table, holding Oliver's favorite toy in her hands. Laura had just gotten off the phone with the courthouse and explained everything. Angela didn't speak. She stared at the toy, gripping it tightly. But what came next was even worse. A court order had also been issued that very morning. Oliver was to be removed from her care immediately and placed under clinical supervision. The officials said it was temporary and for his well-being, but Angela knew better. This was Richard's doing. The same man who barely looked at his son now wanted full control. Angela begged Laura to do something, but there was nothing more she could do through legal means. Within hours, social services arrived and took Oliver away. He screamed for her, cried, and kicked as they dragged him toward the car. Angela tried to follow, but they blocked her. The sound of Oliver calling "Mommy" over and over echoed in her mind. It was worse than anything she had felt before. Days passed, but for Angela, it felt like time had stopped. Her heart felt like it was being crushed. She couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, and couldn't stop thinking about Oliver. She called the clinic where he was taken, but they gave her no real answers. Laura managed to get a nurse on the phone who spoke off the record. Oliver wasn't doing well. He had stopped eating, wasn't responding to anyone, and had started having violent episodes. They didn't know what to do with him. He was collapsing without Angela. The connection between them had been his stability, his calm. Now, he was in a sterile room with strangers. Angela sat on her bed, holding one of Oliver's drawings, feeling like she was losing another child. The pain felt exactly like when she lost her newborn. She thought she would never feel that kind of emptiness again, but now it had returned. Her chest ached, her hands shook, and the helplessness made her feel like she was drowning. Laura couldn't take it anymore, watching Angela fall apart, knowing Oliver was suffering and seeing how easily Richard was manipulating the system. It pushed her past her limits. She made a decision. If the legal path wouldn't work, she would find another way. She started digging deeper into Richard Cooper's history, his businesses, his legal battles, his staff. While searching, she found a small note in an old employee record. It mentioned a woman named Maria, a housekeeper who had worked at the Cooper mansion 2 years ago, but there was no exit date in her file, no official termination, no resignation. Just a sudden stop. Curious, Laura searched for any trace of Maria. She wasn't on social media, no recent tax records. It was like she had disappeared. Laura reached out to other ex-staff, but no one wanted to talk. One finally said something brief. Maria got too close. Then she was gone. That was enough for Laura. If Maria had vanished after working there, maybe she had found out something, just like Angela. Angela listened carefully as Laura told her everything she had found. At first, she was confused. Why was this Maria important now? But as Laura explained that Maria had worked under similar conditions and had also vanished without warning, something clicked. Angela remembered how controlled everything in that house was. The cameras, the rules, the fear. It was too familiar. Maybe she hadn't been the first victim. Maybe Richard had used the same tactics before. Maybe the story with the necklace and the glass was just a recycled method, a trap he had perfected over time. Laura promised to keep digging until she found Maria or someone who knew her. Angela wanted to help, but she was still too weak, emotionally and physically. She felt guilty for not being stronger, for not being able to fight harder for Oliver. But Laura reminded her that what had happened wasn't her fault. They were up against something powerful, something that operated above the law. But now, at least, they knew where to look next. The idea that Maria had once stood where Angela stood now made everything more real. This wasn't just about one case. It was a pattern, a cycle. Angela sat in silence, her mind racing. She thought about Oliver in that clinic, possibly alone in a room, scared and not eating. Her hands curled into fists. She couldn't let this go on. If Maria had answers, they had to find her. Maybe she had evidence, or maybe she had escaped something even worse. Laura was already reaching out to private investigators and making calls to immigration offices, shelters, and old addresses tied to Maria. They couldn't rely on the court anymore. They had to go outside the system. Angela agreed. She was ready to do whatever it took. This wasn't just a legal battle anymore. It was a rescue mission. And now they had a new goal: find Maria, find the truth, and prove that Angela was not the first target. She wouldn't be the last either, unless they stopped Richard once and for all. Laura arrived in a small, quiet town, 2 hours from the city. She had followed a lead that took days to confirm. An old address linked to a woman named Maria, who had once worked at the Cooper mansion. After asking around discreetly, she found Maria living in a small apartment above a bakery, under a different name. Maria was nervous when she first opened the door. She looked tired, older than her age, and scared. But when Laura mentioned Angela, Maria's expression changed. She hesitated, then let her inside. Over a cup of coffee, Maria slowly began to talk. She had been hiding for a long time. Years ago, while working at the Cooper estate, she had started noticing things. Documents left out, names on files that didn't make sense. She saw Oliver's name on property records and strange financial papers. When she questioned it quietly, things turned dark. She was accused of theft. She hadn't stolen anything, but they made it look real. That's when she knew she had to run. Maria continued her story with shaking hands. She told Laura that before she was accused, she had seen Megan in the kitchen handling glasses and plates in a very specific way, wearing gloves, switching them around, and then calling the house staff to clean up afterward. Maria didn't think much of it at the time, but later it matched exactly how she was set up. One morning, an expensive item had gone missing, and the staff were told to cooperate with an internal review. Maria knew it was a trap. That same day, she packed her things and left. No one looked for her, probably because Richard didn't want more attention. She had been living quietly ever since. Laura asked if she would be willing to go public. Maria was scared, but after learning what happened to Angela and Oliver, she agreed. She said she didn't want another innocent person to suffer like she had. Laura recorded the entire conversation. Maria detailed what she saw, how she felt, and why she ran. Laura wasted no time. She returned to the city with the recording and submitted it directly to the court, along with a new motion. This time, with a direct witness from a previous incident, the judge couldn't ignore it. A new hearing was scheduled. The news spread quickly. People remembered Maria's name from old reports, where she had once been accused but never charged. Now she was back, and her story matched what Angela had been saying all along. Angela was notified about the new hearing. At first, she didn't believe it. After so many closed doors and dead ends, it felt unreal. But when she saw the court's official letter, she started to hope again. She would get to speak. She would get to face Richard and Megan one more time. But this time, the truth had backup. Laura helped her prepare, going over every detail, every possible question. Angela was nervous, but more than anything, she wanted to see Oliver again. That was all that mattered. The day of the hearing arrived. The courtroom was full. Reporters were present again, and this time the attention was even bigger. Angela sat at the witness table, heart pounding. Then, through the side door, Oliver entered with a caretaker. He looked around, and when he saw Angela, his face lit up. Without hesitation, he ran toward her and wrapped his arms around her. "Mommy," he said, just like before. His voice was calm but clear. Everyone in the room froze. The judge didn't interrupt. No one said a word. Angela hugged him tightly, tears running down her face. This was no performance. It was real. The connection between them could not be denied. Even some of the people in the gallery started to cry. Oliver sat beside Angela, holding her hand as if he never wanted to let go. It was the kind of moment that no one could fake or rehearse. The judge noted it, and the courtroom took a deep breath. The hearing began, and everything started to shift. During the session, Angela gave her testimony clearly and without hesitation. She spoke about her time in the mansion, her connection with Oliver, the way she had been treated, and how things began to change when she got close to the boy. She described the necklace situation, the strange rules, and the moment in court when Oliver had warned her about the trap. Laura then presented Maria's video testimony. The judge watched it quietly, taking notes. When the recording ended, Megan's behavior changed. She fidgeted, looked at Richard, and began whispering to the assistant next to her. When it was her turn to speak, her voice cracked. She tried to dismiss Maria's claims as old and unreliable, but the courtroom didn't seem convinced. Her usual confidence was gone. Laura leaned over to Angela and whispered, "She's slipping." And it was true. Megan, always calm and calculated, was losing her grip. Richard remained cold, but he wasn't in control anymore. The pressure was building, and everyone could see it. Despite the strong testimony and powerful moments, the judge didn't make a final decision right away. The court needed more. Laura knew this and had expected it. The emotional bond between Angela and Oliver was undeniable, and Maria's words had weakened Richard's defense. But there was still no hard proof directly linking Richard or Megan to the manipulation of evidence. The defense used that point repeatedly, saying there was no physical link, only words. But even so, the atmosphere had changed. The room no longer saw Angela as a suspect. She was seen as a victim, as a mother figure, as someone who had been hurt but still stood strong. Laura promised Angela that they were closer than ever. "They're running out of places to hide," she said. Angela nodded, her hand still holding Oliver's. She felt it too. The circle was closing around them. One last piece was missing, one final proof that would break everything wide open. And now, more than ever, Angela believed they would find it. The courtroom was filled with tension as everyone waited for the next step in the case. This time, things were different. The judge had agreed to allow Oliver to participate in the hearing, but only under special conditions. A therapist sat beside him, ready to help him communicate in a way that felt safe for him. Angela watched nervously from across the room, unsure how Oliver would react in such a serious environment. But when he entered, holding a small bag of toys and crayons, he walked straight to the table prepared for him. The therapist gently guided him as he took out small dolls and placed them on the table. With careful movements, Oliver began arranging them to represent the people involved. He used one figure to show Megan standing by a table. Then he took another figure and positioned it further back. This one was meant to be Richard. Step by step, without words, Oliver started to recreate what he had seen that day. The entire room became silent, watching every move. Oliver didn't speak much, but he didn't need to. He placed a small plastic cup next to the Megan figure, then swapped it with another cup. The meaning was clear. He was showing how she had switched the glass. Then he pointed to the Richard figure, who was standing far away, watching everything happen but not doing anything to stop it. Next, Oliver picked up a third doll, one that clearly represented Angela, and gently held its arm. He looked at the therapist and quietly said, "Mommy." Then he pointed to the moment when he had stopped her hand, showing how he had stopped her from touching the glass. The judge leaned forward, visibly moved by the scene. Tears appeared in some of the audience members' eyes. The therapist calmly explained what each part of the reenactment meant, confirming that Oliver was retelling events as he remembered them, without coaching or suggestion. The emotions in the courtroom were strong. The child's innocence and clarity spoke louder than any lawyer ever could. The judge asked a few simple follow-up questions through the therapist, and Oliver responded with drawings. He drew a hand in a glove, then a cup. Then he drew two faces, one smiling, Angela, and one with a blank expression, Richard. These simple images, created by a young boy who barely spoke, carried a weight that documents and arguments hadn't managed to achieve. After a few more minutes, the judge stood and called a break. Her voice was shaky as she said the courtroom needed time to process what had just happened. She ordered that a full investigation be opened into all security systems, documents, and staff records at the Cooper mansion. Everyone in the room knew that something big had shifted. Angela covered her mouth, trying not to cry, while Oliver reached over and hugged her. She didn't care who was watching. The bond between them had now been shown in front of everyone, strong, true, and impossible to ignore. They had taken another step closer to the truth. Meanwhile, Laura had continued working behind the scenes. She had been following a lead from an old IT contractor who once worked at the Cooper estate. He had contacted her anonymously, saying that he had a backup copy of the security system from the week before the trial. It took days to find him in person and confirm the file's authenticity. But when she finally received the backup, Laura knew it could be the key they were missing. She didn't waste any time. She brought the files to a trusted technician and asked him to search specifically for the days surrounding the missing necklace and the glass incident. The technician spent hours going through the footage frame by frame. Then finally they found it. The full recording showed Megan entering the sitting room wearing gloves. She looked around, checked the door, and switched one glass with another from a separate tray she had brought in. The timestamp was clear. It was the night before the hearing, the exact moment Angela had been framed. Laura stared at the screen, hardly believing it. Everything they had said was true. The video showed it all, and this time there were no cuts, no missing pieces. It was the complete footage that had never been shown in court. Megan had clearly manipulated the scene, and Richard had let it happen. There was no way they could explain this away. Laura copied the footage to several secure drives and rushed it to the courthouse. She submitted the files as new evidence, attaching technical reports that confirmed the video had not been tampered with. When the judge saw the new material, she ordered a temporary halt to all other motions and scheduled an emergency session to review the video. This wasn't just new information, it was a game changer. For the first time, the case was turning in Angela's favor in a way that couldn't be blocked or delayed. Laura called Angela right away and said, "We got it. They can't hide anymore." Angela didn't speak. She just cried quietly on the phone. Though the case wasn't over, the direction had changed. Angela was no longer being seen as a possible thief or liar. She was being recognized as someone who had been framed, manipulated, and torn from the child she loved. The public's view was shifting too. News outlets picked up Oliver's reenactment. Videos of his small hands showing the truth spread across social media. People started asking serious questions about Richard and Megan. Legal analysts began to say that if this evidence held up, it would not only clear Angela's name, but could also lead to criminal charges against both of them. Still, the system moved slowly. Angela remained cautious. She had seen how fast things could change. But deep inside, she felt something different now, hope. Oliver was safe, she was heard, and someone finally believed her enough to fight beside her. They weren't finished yet, but they were no longer alone. The truth was out there now, and it was getting harder and harder for anyone to silence it. The courtroom was tense as the full, uncut footage was finally played on the large screen in front of the judge, jury, lawyers, and spectators. The video clearly showed Megan entering the sitting room alone, wearing latex gloves. She looked around the space, checked the door, and walked straight to the table where the glasses were placed. Without hesitation, she took one glass, replaced it with another from a tray she had carried in, and carefully adjusted everything to make it look untouched. The date and timestamp at the bottom corner of the screen left no room for doubt. It happened the night before the hearing, where Angela was almost accused. The courtroom was silent as everyone watched. Megan never realized the footage had survived in a backup server. Laura sat beside Angela, watching the judge's expression closely. When the video ended, the defense tried to respond quickly. They claimed the footage could have been digitally edited. They said deepfake technology existed, but the courtroom had already started to shift. The truth was taking over. Digital forensic experts were brought in to confirm the video's authenticity. One by one, they stood and explained how the footage had been verified. They spoke clearly, showing technical reports, backup logs, and analysis that proved the file was original, unaltered, and taken directly from the security system's backup. There were no signs of editing or tampering. Megan's actions were undeniable. She had changed the glass, knowing what it meant, and Richard had allowed it to happen, but that wasn't the end. Around the same time, Laura received more documents. This time, from an anonymous source connected to one of Richard's former financial consultants. The paperwork showed a long trail of asset transfers, properties, business shares, and large financial accounts had been moved under Oliver's name without any legal guardianship structure. It meant that Richard had been hiding his assets using his son's identity. And anyone who discovered it, like Maria or Angela, became a threat. The courtroom was no longer dealing with just a framing incident. It had turned into something far bigger. The news spread fast. Reporters gathered outside, updates flew across social media, and the public watched everything unfold live. Inside the courtroom, Megan's behavior changed suddenly. As the weight of the evidence piled up, she looked pale and restless. During a short break, she tried to leave the courthouse unnoticed, but officers caught her near the back exit. She was immediately taken into custody. Hours later, her lawyer returned to the courtroom and asked for a private session. Megan had agreed to cooperate in exchange for a reduced sentence. She confessed to helping Richard frame multiple employees, including Angela and Maria. She admitted to altering items, planting false evidence, and staying quiet about the financial crimes. Her written statement was read in court, shocking everyone. She described Richard's plan in detail: use his son's name to protect assets, create distractions with false accusations, and make sure no one ever got close to the truth. Her collapse changed everything. What was once a complicated case had now become a full criminal investigation. The judge had no choice but to pause the trial for 48 hours. So many new accusations had emerged that the court needed time to review, organize, and decide on the full list of charges. Megan's confession triggered a chain reaction, and legal teams had to process everything carefully. The courtroom emptied slowly as people began to understand how deep the lies had gone. Outside, cameras flashed and news reporters gave live updates. Angela was escorted out quietly through a side door with Laura and Oliver. They returned to the temporary housing where they had been staying while the case unfolded. That night, Oliver curled up beside Angela on the couch, holding one of his stuffed toys. He was calm. He had started eating again. His sleeping patterns were better. Angela watched him rest, gently brushing his hair back with her fingers. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to breathe deeply. The danger wasn't over, but it was no longer hidden. She kissed Oliver's forehead and whispered, "We're almost there." She remembered the day she first arrived at the mansion, how nervous and lost she had felt. She had been running from grief, still haunted by the loss of her newborn son. Now, months later, she realized she hadn't just saved a child, she had been saved too. Oliver had given her purpose. He had trusted her when no one else did. He had stood up for her when she couldn't speak for herself. Through all the chaos, lies, and fear, they had found something real. It wasn't just about justice anymore. It was about healing. Angela wiped a tear from her cheek, not from sadness, but from understanding. She wasn't just Oliver's caretaker anymore. She was his mother in every way that mattered. He had filled the space in her heart that had once felt permanently broken. Together, they were stronger. Together, they had survived something that should have destroyed them both. In the next room, Oliver stirred in his sleep, but didn't wake up. Angela checked on him one last time before heading to bed. As she lay down, her mind ran through everything that had happened: the setup, the courtroom moments, Megan's confession, and the new investigation. It wasn't over yet. Richard still hadn't been arrested. The court still had to decide on the final charges. But now, Angela felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. And it wasn't just hope for herself, but for Oliver too. They had both been victims. They had both been used. But now they had each other. And now they had the truth on their side. She closed her eyes and allowed herself to rest. No more waiting in fear. No more walking on eggshells. Whatever came next, she wouldn't face it alone. Because Oliver was not just a boy she cared for. He was her son, and she was his mother. That bond couldn't be faked, broken, or silenced anymore. The courtroom was silent as the final decision was read aloud. After months of investigation, hearings, evidence analysis, and witness testimony, the trial had reached its conclusion. Richard Cooper, once seen as a powerful and respected businessman, now stood as a convicted criminal. The charges were clear: attempted fraud, manipulation of evidence, and illegal use of documents involving his own son's identity. The judge detailed the ruling calmly but firmly. She pointed to the undeniable security footage, the confirmed forensic reports, and the full confession given by Megan. Richard showed no emotion as the sentence was delivered. His lawyers had no more strategies. Megan, who had broken down during her last testimony, also received a formal sentence. Her reduced punishment was granted due to her cooperation, but it still meant time behind bars. The courtroom watched quietly, knowing justice had finally been served. Reporters outside began to prepare headlines. Inside, Angela sat holding Oliver's hand. She didn't cry. She simply closed her eyes for a moment and let herself breathe. It was over. Angela's name was cleared in full. The court confirmed she had been a victim of manipulation from the beginning. She was not only declared innocent, but also recognized as someone who had been wrongly accused and emotionally damaged by a system she never wanted to be a part of. A compensation package was approved, enough to rebuild her life. But to Angela, money wasn't the most important part of the decision. What mattered most came right after the verdict. The judge opened a second file and addressed her with a softer tone. Based on psychological evaluations, therapist reports, and the visible bond between her and Oliver, the court approved Angela as Oliver's legal temporary guardian. The process for permanent custody would take more time, but this step meant everything. Angela held Oliver tightly as the judge spoke. Oliver smiled and leaned on her shoulder. For both of them, this was a moment of peace. They had been separated, tested, and pushed to the edge. But now they had something official: each other. Later that afternoon, after the courtroom had mostly cleared out, a small group stayed behind for a quiet moment the judge had arranged privately. Angela, Laura, the therapist, and Oliver stood by the bench. The judge knelt down slightly to speak to Oliver on his level, thanking him for his bravery and honesty. Then, without being prompted, Oliver reached into his backpack and handed her a folded piece of paper. Inside was a drawing, himself and Angela holding hands with a red heart drawn between them. He had used colored pencils, and even though the lines weren't perfect, the meaning was. The judge took the drawing and paused, holding back tears. She looked at Angela and said, "Sometimes justice is more than laws and evidence. Sometimes it's in moments like this." The room stayed quiet for a moment longer, taking it in. Oliver, usually shy and withdrawn, smiled proudly. It wasn't just a drawing. It was his way of saying he knew he was safe now, that he belonged with Angela. In the weeks that followed, things began to settle into a new rhythm. Angela moved with Oliver into a small rented house arranged through a support program for families affected by legal injustice. It wasn't big or fancy, but it was warm and filled with love. Oliver had his own room, decorated with soft lights and drawings he hung up himself. He began speaking more at home and during therapy sessions. His therapist noted significant progress in his communication and emotional response. He no longer had as many meltdowns. He responded better to structure and affection. Every night, Angela read to him before bed, and he always asked for a hug. Sometimes he would fall asleep holding her hand. Angela, in turn, began to smile more. She had dark days still, when her past came back to her thoughts, but they were becoming fewer. Taking care of Oliver gave her purpose. It reminded her that love didn't come from biology. It came from connection, patience, and shared healing. She had lost a child once. Life had given her one back. News about the case continued spreading. It appeared in documentaries, podcasts, and national newspapers. People across the country followed the story, not just because of the crime, but because of the powerful bond between a woman and a boy who had nothing but pain when they met, and everything to gain by staying together. Angela declined most interviews, choosing to focus on home life and Oliver's well-being, but she allowed one small piece to be written about the custody decision so that other families could understand the importance of emotional bonds in healing trauma. Laura stayed involved as a friend and supporter, often visiting and bringing books for Oliver. The legal process for full adoption was already in motion, and even though it would take time, no one doubted how it would end. Angela had become more than just a caregiver. She had become his mother in every way that counted. Oliver had found safety, trust, and love. Angela had found a second chance she never thought was possible. On a quiet Sunday morning, Angela sat on the couch with a photo album open in her lap. Oliver was drawing nearby, humming softly to himself. The house smelled of pancakes, and sunlight came through the windows. It was just an ordinary day, but for them, it was everything. Angela looked at a photo someone had taken outside the courtroom on the day of the verdict. She and Oliver were holding hands, smiling. It was the kind of smile that only came after surviving something impossible. She closed the album and looked over at him. "Hey, do you want to go to the park later?" she asked. Oliver nodded without hesitation. There were still things ahead: school applications, court paperwork, new therapy steps, but for now they had peace, and that was enough. Angela knew now that life didn't always give you what you expect. It often gives you what you need. She didn't give birth to Oliver, but she received him as a gift. A child who brought her back to life, and whom she now called her son. Months had passed since the courtroom battles ended, and Angela and Oliver now lived in a quiet, modest house at the edge of a small neighborhood. It wasn't big or luxurious, but it was full of life. The walls were covered with photos and colorful drawings, most of them made by Oliver. There were pictures of their trip to the zoo, hand-painted signs with both their names, and even a drawing of the courthouse, with a smiling sun in the corner. Angela kept everything. Every paper, every crayon mark, it all meant something. Their home smelled like warm food and fresh laundry. Music often played softly in the background, and laughter wasn't rare anymore. Angela had found a job at a local community center where she worked with families and domestic workers, helping them understand their rights. She also gave talks at schools, public events, and social programs about justice, resilience, and the importance of protecting workers from abuse. People listened to her because she spoke with truth. She had lived it. Oliver now attended an inclusive school that focused on children with different learning needs. His teachers said he was one of the most curious and observant students in class. He used to be quiet and withdrawn, but now he spoke clearly, asked questions, and participated in activities with the other children. Therapy was still part of his routine, but it had become something he looked forward to instead of something he feared. Angela would walk him to school every morning, holding his hand and listening to whatever story he had to share. Sometimes it was about his dreams, sometimes about his drawings, and sometimes about simple things like what snack he wanted. He had favorite books now, and even made a few close friends. At night he slept peacefully, no longer afraid. He'd stopped asking if he would be taken away again. Instead, he started planning his birthdays, choosing Halloween costumes, and calling Angela Mom without hesitation. It didn't sound forced. It was natural. It belonged to them, and it was real. Angela never missed a school meeting or therapy appointment. She made sure Oliver knew he was safe, loved, and never alone. Their life was built on trust, and that trust was something both of them had fought hard to earn. She didn't try to erase his past or hide from her own. They talked about everything in ways he could understand. Angela wanted him to grow up knowing that what they had gone through didn't define them, but it had helped shape their strength. She often spoke to groups of domestic workers, many of whom were immigrants or single mothers, reminding them that their voices mattered. She told them about how silence had been used against her and how speaking out had been the turning point. Sometimes she would bring Oliver along. He would sit at the back, quietly drawing or reading, but always close. People who met them could see that their bond wasn't built on convenience or charity. It was built on survival, healing, and choice. Their house was full of routines, but they weren't rigid. Saturday mornings were for pancake breakfasts and messy crafts. Sundays were quiet. They might go to the park, visit a friend, or stay home watching old cartoons. Angela and Oliver had built traditions that didn't require money or big plans. They only needed time together. Oliver had a drawer filled with plastic cups of all colors. He picked a new one each day, blue for play days, red for reading days, green for extra happy days. Angela never questioned it. In fact, she joined him, choosing her cup of the day too. There were no cameras watching them, no one controlling what they said or did. The fear that used to hang over their heads was gone. They didn't live in constant alert anymore. Angela still locked the door at night, out of habit, but she no longer jumped at every sound. They had a home now. Not just a place to live, but a space where they could breathe, grow, and be themselves without looking over their shoulders. The memory of the glass that almost destroyed their lives never completely disappeared, but it lost its power. The courtroom, the lies, the setup, it all became something they talked about occasionally, mostly when Angela was preparing for one of her lectures. But the fear was no longer there. They had taken something that was once a symbol of manipulation and turned it into something harmless. Now they drank juice from bright plastic cups picked out by Oliver himself. They were light, safe, unbreakable. In a way, those simple cups came to represent everything they had been through. They were nothing special to anyone else, but to Angela, they meant freedom. She often thought about how such a small object once stood at the center of so much pain, and how now it was just a part of their daily life, ordinary and safe. The cups weren't fancy, they didn't match, but they were theirs. No more traps, no more pretending. Just a real life, shared between two people who had learned how to trust again. One afternoon, while sitting at the kitchen table, Angela poured juice into two of the colorful cups, one orange, one green. Oliver sat across from her, telling her about his day at school. He had drawn a new comic with a superhero that looked a little like her. He saves people who don't have a voice, he explained. Angela smiled and told him that was the best kind of hero. They clinked their cups together and took a sip. No tension, no fear. Just a quiet kitchen and two people who had found each other when they both needed it most. They weren't a perfect family. They didn't have all the answers, but they were together. That was enough. Angela looked at Oliver and felt a deep peace. Not the kind that comes all at once, but the kind that builds slowly, one honest moment at a time. They had built something strong from something broken. They weren't related by blood, but they had become everything to each other, and that made them a real family. Finally, we've reached the end of this story. I'm extremely happy that you've made it this far. Thank you very much for watching. Comment below what you thought and what was the best or worst part. Don't forget to subscribe. Until next time.